Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub gives an update on harvest progress. Julie Peterson discusses Western bean cutworm control. Tamra Jackson-Ziems describes scouting recommendations for ear rot diseases. And Stephen Ostroff outlines the Food Safety Modernization Act. Elaine Kub is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. U.S. farmers have harvested 46% of this season's corn and 62% of this year's soybeans. Those numbers are just behind the nation's 5-year average, but there is variability among the top producers. While Illinois is 10 points ahead of its normal pace in corn, Iowa is 12 points behind, and Nebraska is off by 6 points. Iowa and Nebraska are also 12 points slower than their 5-year averages for soybean harvest. Elaine joined us from South Dakota Thursday morning, and we began by asking her about harvest progress and yield results.
Well, this is all anecdotal, right? Except for the harvest progress numbers, which comes from an official USDA report. And I was surprised to see that we have not hit the halfway mark in the corn market or the corn harvest, which I suppose makes sense when you consider some weather delays that have occurred right in the center of the Corn Belt. But I think it's not far enough back to be concerned about. It's not perhaps a market mover in this sense, but we're in the general halfway range for the corn harvest, yeah.
Any updates on yields, or at least ones that you're willing to stake your name on?
Yeah, the interesting thing is how closely the harvest reports just off the combine from folks really match what the USDA has showed in their trimming of the corn yields month by month, but their raising of the soybean yields. The soybean yields, and this is pretty universal, not just South Dakota, but Iowa and all across the Corn Belt and Nebraska, is that the soybean yields are surprisingly great for a not perfect year. So we used to say that about wheat, right? Wheat is a weed and you can't kill it, and hardly anything will ever change the yields on wheat. And now it's seeming like the soybeans, the technology in the seed, or what the scenario is, they're really resilient.
We had that crop report last week, and this week describe how differently corn and soybean markets have moved.
Yeah, soybeans are probably the leader, I think we can say that, but it's nice to see that corn is chugging along. I would say that both of them are in a short-term uptrend, and both of them are probably being led by some export buying, some commercial buying in that market. But soybeans are definitely the leader, and that may be related to some outside market things like the Malaysian palm oil market, which has also stayed high, surprisingly high, when you consider how kind of bubbly that top looked in August.
Compared to corn, does that narrow spread in soybeans show you anything?
It does. Historically, both of these two markets should be different. We tend to see the larger spreads in the corn and more storing of the corn and more of the quick shipping of the soybeans. But to see that the soybeans are not inverted at this time, they're just a fairly normal spread, means that we are going to see the soybeans continue to move, particularly on the river. They're moving down to the Gulf. There's good export buying, like I mentioned. There's good export movement. Certainly we see that in the weekly reports for soybeans, but also for corn. And we throw wheat in there too. The wheat spreads are very, very wide, 70, almost 80 cents, I think, for a year out to store wheat. So if you're looking at the commercial industry's opportunities to store grain, they're going to look at storing wheat first, and that may be affecting some of the corn space that we have in elevators, particularly in Nebraska and Kansas. They are struggling to find some space for the corn because they're plugged up with wheat, but corn is also a good storing opportunity, particularly out in the piles.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. With maybe a little bit of crop left over, is there enough storage room out there, or how much is going to have to go on the ground?
It depends on how you define enough. I mean, is there enough storage space in traditional concrete and steel bins? Absolutely not. When we look at the last grain stocks report plus the anticipated volume of harvest, it's an unsolvable problem. But it is a solvable problem when the elevators go out and start building the bunkers, the covered bunkers, or they can store in bags, or they put them in piles. And we have seen that volume expand dramatically even in the past year. It's expanded, I think, over the past 5 years. There's been a trend of the industry going towards this emergency and temporary storage. But in the past 1 year, year over year, that space has expanded more than 30%. And even within just the last few weeks, 3 weeks ago, I looked at it and there was less than 200 million bushels out in uncovered emergency piles. Now we're over that amount. So we've added millions of bushels of space just sort of out on the ground. So that's how they solve this unsolvable problem.
Is any of that impacting basis?
I think it helps basis in that it takes some of the pressure off of the urgency of finding a shuttle train or finding some place to get rid of the stuff. You know, if you can put it on a pile and feel confident that you can store it there, capture that carry, maybe gives you some time to find a train in March or sometime in the winter, I think it helps keep basis from falling apart to the degree that we saw in 2013 and 2014.
All right, in South Dakota, do you get the sense that after this crop, these two crops come off, there's going to be fewer wheat acres that get seeded, and maybe that has an impact on what gets planted next spring?
Well, I think so far we've seen winter wheat seeding somewhat in South Dakota, but certainly in Nebraska and Kansas. We've seen winter wheat seeding really strong because the weather, for one thing, is just really cooperating here. There's lots of opportunities to get out there and seed wheat. I don't know that we're going to see that acreage increase, and even if we do see the fall planting acreage increase, that doesn't tell me anything about what will happen when spring comes around. That could be grazed, it could be grazed off and never harvested for grain, or it could just be abandoned and planted to some other crop, particularly if something happens this winter to make soybeans or corn seem actually profitable and appealing. There's a slim chance that we have this weak La Nina that could perhaps spark some kind of a rally due to South American concerns. Then all of a sudden you would much rather be planting corn than soybeans, and we'll get rid of whatever, not all of them, but some of the winter wheat acres that are being planted right now.
Closing out, looking at your price forecast for corn and soybeans, do I get the sense that you're just a touch bullish?
I am not. I am neutral, but I think that there is that chance for a weak La Nina or something to happen here. And I think seasonally we would expect it to go a little bit higher. I'm not bearish. Let's put it this way. I do think that the harvest lows are behind us. I'm just not particularly optimistic. I'm not expecting to see $10 for soybeans, for instance. You know, I think that we just have a limited opportunities when we have crops of this large size.
We'll look at corn and soybean markets next week, and Scott Brown from the University of Missouri will also join us to give an update on dairy markets. Growers using the Cry1F trait to protect against western bean cutworm damage in corn may be seeing disappointing results. Entomologists from universities at Purdue, Michigan State, Ohio State, Cornell, and Penn State wrote an open letter earlier this month describing struggles controlling the insect with the Cry1F trait. They say Cry1F fails to provide observable benefit to producers. Nebraska Extension entomologist Julie Peterson is located in North Platte, where western bean cutworm is a typical pest for farmers. We spoke with her in Lincoln Wednesday morning to discuss the challenge growers are facing this season in certain corn growing areas across the country.
This year we had some interesting reports actually coming from some of the states further east of Nebraska. There was an open letter published by 6 different extension entomologists from some of the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Ohio, New York. So in those states this year, they have actually been reporting greater damage from western bean cutworm to field corn, in particular corn that does express the Cry1F protein, which is a protein that's found in Herculex, Smart Stacks, and some other types of BT hybrids.
Have Nebraska farmers noticed the same types of problems?
Yes, we have. We've actually been seeing these problems with some of our Cry1F performance over several years in Nebraska. I've spoken with crop consultants and farmers, particularly in areas further west in the state, the southwest part of the state, and now also more of the central Platte River Valley. We have had reports of poor performance of Cry1F hybrids in those areas for several years in Nebraska now.
Can you give me some background on where western bean cutworm has traditionally been a problem?
Certainly western Nebraska, northeast Colorado, and into Wyoming. That's really been the historic region for western bean cutworm populations. However, we saw a really big shift in their distribution starting around the year 2000. Those populations, we do still have them in that historic region, but they've now also spread eastward, going all the way as far as New York. We do now have established western bean cutworm populations in these eastern Corn Belt states, as well as Ontario. Southern Ontario in Canada is now really a hot spot for western bean cutworm.
Focusing on Cry1F, is it still effective against other pests?
Yes, it is. Cry1F was really introduced to target some other types of lepidopteran, other types of caterpillars that feed on corn ears, such as European corn borer. Western bean cutworm was never actually the primary target for Cry1F. When it was first introduced in 2001, it was reported that the protein was about 80% effective. So I think that's important to note, is that even when it was first on the market, there was never a 100% control against western bean cutworm.
How does this add to the resistance problems that farmers are noticing in this area?
It certainly is an issue. Cry1F and one other protein called VIP3A are really the only two commercial proteins that we have that do have any effectiveness against western bean cutworm. So we really are down to just the one, the VIP3A, which is in Viptera and some other types of hybrids. So this really limits us. If we only have one type of BT protein, one mode of action there, we really are not able to rotate that then, and we can put higher selection pressure for resistance on western bean cutworm.
What's the recommendation to farmers then who are looking for control options in next year's seeds?
Certainly when you go to do your seed selection, you want to keep that in mind, that with Cry1F, we are not expecting to have good control against western bean cutworm in Nebraska, particularly if you're in some of those hot spot areas, the southwest part of the state and then the central Platte River Valley. So whenever you're doing your hybrid selection, we encourage you to look at the handy BT trait table. It has good information about which insects you do get control for which different types of hybrids. And certainly if you're growing Cry1F or a non-BT hybrid, we really encourage heavy scouting for western bean cutworm, going out when those moths are flying, looking at the egg masses and using the economic thresholds. We recommend a 5 to 8% economic threshold for western bean. We recommend that you scout all of your acres, but really focusing on western bean for those non-BT or Cry1F fields is very important.
Julie says western bean cutworm is also difficult to manage because of the tight window for scouting damage. You can find more about Cry1F and western bean cutworm, as well as the BT trait table Julie mentioned, through links on the Market Journal website. The October Nebraska Farmer says if there's one word to describe Nancy Peterson's record keeping, it's meticulous. This month's magazine says she can tell you the stocking rates on certain pastures in a given grazing season, when cattle went onto a pasture, when they left, and how much residual forage remained. Nancy, her husband Rex, and son Patrick have managed Plum Thicket Farm on the northern edge of the Sandhills since 1998. They are the recipient of the 2016 Nebraska Leopold Conservation Award. You can read about how the Petersons prepare their ranch to stay resilient in the face of drought in the October Nebraska Farmer. Nebraska's corn harvest is 34% complete, 6 points behind the state's 5-year average. The USDA's latest progress report lists 73% of the crop in good to excellent condition. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says producers do need to be aware of ear rot issues that have been observed in some areas of Nebraska. Tamra says farmers may need to handle that grain differently to ensure it maintains its quality.
Well, this year we're beginning to see a little bit of ear rot diseases showing up in various parts of the state. Certainly a little too early to know if this is widespread or not, but there are a few here and there. And so it's a good idea for our producers to be aware of that and to get out and scout fields to determine what that incidence and severity is. This is going to be important for the decision-making process as far as harvest gets going and how to handle that grain to prevent further damage in storage. Keep in mind that most of these will continue to grow in storage even under the best storage conditions. And so if they know they've got a problem with certain fields, those might be the ones you don't want to have in storage for long term. So at this point, there's been no confirmation of aflatoxin in Nebraska, nor high concentrations of any other mycotoxins. And although some of those may be a possibility, I want to make sure this is more about a grain quality issue and making sure that we're safeguarding the corn going into the bin so that what we have come out later is high quality. Fields that might be high risk might be ones that had more insect damage, because ears that are damaged are ones that are more prone to be infected, or any fields that may have been hailed on may also be higher risk for ear rot diseases.
Tamra's recent Crop Watch article on ear rot diseases can be found through a link on the Market Journal website. It contains more resources on specific kinds of ear rots, as well as information about testing grains for mycotoxins. In what it calls the most sweeping reform of food safety laws in over 70 years, the Food and Drug Administration has finalized rules for the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. Those rules are not yet implemented, but they cover a range of measures for human and animal foods. The FDA says about 3,000 Americans die each year from foodborne illness, and 1 in 6 get sick. Stephen Ostroff is the FDA's Deputy Commissioner for Foods and Veterinary Medicine. He says the U.S. has one of the most diverse food supplies in the world and imports food from more than 200 countries. Ostroff says it's the FDA's responsibility to ensure the safety of both the domestic food supply and that coming in from other nations around the world. Ostroff was in Lincoln last month for the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture's annual meeting. We spoke with him at the event about the importance of the Food Safety Modernization Act.
So the Food Safety Modernization Act was something that was passed by Congress in 2010. It was signed into law by the President in 2011. And it's actually the biggest change in food regulation in the United States, or I should say food safety regulation in the United States, probably that will ever occur in any of our lifetimes. And it's the biggest change to the way that FDA oversees and regulates food since the 1930s. And it was passed in response to a couple of very, very large and difficult foodborne outbreaks that occurred in the late 2000s. And so it was designed to move the food safety system from always reacting to problems that occur to trying to prevent them from occurring in the first place. And it was also designed to look at all aspects of the food production system from the farm right to the fork. But there are a number of different regulations. One of them has to do with what we refer to as preventive controls for human foods. These are for the things that you buy in your grocery store. The second is the same for animal foods, the first time that we've had them in place for animal foods. One is the produce safety rule, and to improve the safety of things that are grown on the farm, fruits and vegetables grown on the farm. One of them is something called foreign supplier verification, because one of the central ideas behind FSMA is that we have to assure that food produced outside of the United States is every bit as safe as food that's produced in the United States. And so there has to be equivalency in the quality of the way food is produced outside the United States that is imported into the country. And then in addition to that, there's a regulation covering the way that the food is transported from the producer to the consumer, called sanitary transportation, because you can do everything right on the farm or you can do everything right in the manufacturing plant, but if you contaminate it after it leaves in the truck or the train, then it's all for naught. And then the last one has to do with the topic of food defense, and so to try to prevent malicious or intentional adulteration of foods. And so all that is subsumed under the Food Safety Modernization Act.
Can you walk me through what happens when you think there might be a foodborne illness or outbreak or contamination?
Yeah, so I will say that before I worked at FDA, I worked at our sister agency, the Centers for Disease Control, the group that actually goes out and investigates disease outbreaks. So I've seen it from both sides. from the standpoint of human illness as well as from the standpoint of food production. And so usually what happens is most of the time when there's some thought, some indication that there might be a foodborne disease problem, it gets investigated either by folks at the local level or it gets investigated by folks at the state level. They feed information into either the CDC or the FDA about the situation. Our job at FDA is to look at the potentially implicated food and to take a look to see if we can piece together all the information from the people who are ill that leads us to some sort of a common food item. And then once we identify what the potential food item may be, we then have to sort of trace it backwards to figure out where it came from and what might be the cause, because the one thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to say, just as an example, it's the salsa, and then pick the wrong item within the salsa that might be the cause of the problem. So all of that has to be traced back and see where it leads to so that we can take some sort of an action that might eventually put things to a halt.
And one of the tools that allows you to do that quicker or easier is a sequencing aspect?
Yeah, so most people know that there are certain types of germs that produce foodborne illness. They're familiar with salmonella, or they're familiar with E. coli, or there's a sort of a number of them. Campylobacter is another one that causes human illness. But within the salmonella and the Campylobacter, just like people, all of them are slightly different from each other, even though they're all sort of in the same family and they're the same salmonella. And so you can do things to actually fingerprint them. What we now do is we now do something called whole genome sequencing, where we actually take the genetic material from the salmonella and we look at the entire sequence, all of those letters that you see in the genetic code, and we can determine the exact sequence of that particular organism, and we can compare it to other sequences. And so when we had this outbreak last year from ice cream, you may remember that one, where there were relatively small numbers of human cases. By doing something like that, by comparing, and in this case it was listeria, by comparing the listerias through whole genome sequencing that were found in the products and also in the plants, we actually found human cases that had occurred 2 or 3 years beforehand. So it's a remarkable tool, and it's remarkably effective. It's still something that's kind of in its infancy in terms of being used, but it will very soon be the standard that we use for foodborne disease investigations.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week, the main thing that we had in terms of weather was really nice conditions. We did have a little bit of fog last weekend, and in portions of eastern Nebraska, it took a while to burn that fog off, but we did actually see the sunshine, and we actually seen some above normal temperatures. Now, as we've gone through this week, we did see a front move through that brought in slightly cooler temperatures, but once again, the ridge is going to rebuild back into our region, and we're looking at very nice harvest activity weather once again through at least the middle of next week before we see yet another storm system come into our region that might, and I say might, give us a shot of some acceptable moisture, particularly in eastern Nebraska, but if you're in the western half of the state, not a very promising picture in terms of moisture. So let's get right to the weather models. And one thing I'll draw your attention to, in the upper atmosphere we have this big ridge. The little low pressure system is moving along the periphery of this ridge. We'll bring the wet and inclement weather to the upper Midwest, but will bypass us. The ridge starts building as we go into Sunday, bringing much warmer conditions into our region. We do have a surface low down in Texas that will remain fairly stationary. And then we will see that basically that ridge remains in place on Monday, so very nice conditions. And then as we go into Tuesday, we start to see some energy moving into the southwestern United States, and that'll start moving up into the northern Rockies, and some of that will start to impact us as we get into Wednesday, and that spillover may generate some precipitation in eastern Nebraska. More importantly, it looks like this more significant moisture will be to the east of us, and then the ridge builds right back in on Thursday, and we start to see a warming trend. And as we get into Friday, we see another piece of wave moving out across the southern plains with this cold front coming down from the north, showing us a potential for some convergence here in the central United States and maybe a little bit of precipitation as we go into next weekend, although the latest models are indicating that some of that may actually fall in western Nebraska. Now, as we go into the precipitation, what you will notice is very high and dry, heavy precipitation up in the northeast, and that kind of moves out with some snow raining tomorrow, a little bit of precipitation coming into the western United States, and on Monday it starts to move farther inshore, a little bit in the southern plains, starts to break out on Tuesday. Some of this actually skirting up into extreme southeastern Nebraska, and you'll see that the heavier precipitation breaks out over Iowa on Wednesday, leaving most of Nebraska dry, and then we start to see that ridge build back in with very little in the way of precipitation. Here comes our next piece of energy coming into the southwest that will eventually start to move that moisture into the central plains. The big question is, who will get the moisture once it does emerge next weekend? Now, as we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast from the following next Thursday to the following Tuesday, we do indicate that the ridge is going to remain in place with that trough pretty much stationary over the western United States, and CPC does increase precipitation for the western two-thirds of the United States. Now, I will say this, based on what I've seen in the models, this is way overdone. Basically, we're looking at the southwest and the interior mountain regions up into the northern plains and the Great Lakes, but a large substantial area in the central and southern plains right now does not look like it's going to see much in the way of significant moisture. Now, the Climate Prediction Center has issued their 3-month forecast, and this would take us from November through January, indicating above normal temperatures across the southwestern and southern plains, extending all the way to the southeastern United States. And in terms of precipitation, we see 2 primary areas above normal precipitation: Montana down through northern portions of Wyoming, and then of course the Great Lakes region. I think that this will probably push a little bit farther to the west, and of course we'll see much more precipitation in the eastern Corn Belt for us. I think this is a fairly safe forecast, equal chances of above normal, below normal, or normal moisture.
Thanks, Sal. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, western bean cutworm, ear rot diseases, and the Food Safety Modernization Act. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also find more information about the Market Journal Roadshow coming up in November and December at marketjournal.unl.edu/roadshow. Next week, University of Missouri Extension Ag economist Scott Brown will give an overview of the dairy markets, and Tina Barrett will discuss tax preparations. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.